Thank you, Chair. Mr. Benson-Clark, I just want to ask you, please, about Section 5 of the standards for mental health inpatient care, which is your Exhibit ABC, and in particular the top of page 15, please. Thank you very much. And I want to ask you about resuscitation teams and responding personnel. You've, in fact, covered quite a lot of this already during the course of your previous evidence. But if we just look, please, at point number one, under resuscitation teams and or responding personnel, it draws together some of the evidence that you've given insofar as it says, unless the organisation that delivers mental health care is situated on the same site as an acute hospital, which provides a resuscitation team that is specifically contracted to deliver an on-call service, a 999 ambulance should be called immediately for any patient who collapses. In the interval before an ambulance arrives, staff of the mental health service should be capable of deploying the skills that are identified in point 4 below. And if we jump down to point 4 below, please, which is on page 16, you indicate that the staff who respond immediately must have the following minimum skills. So that's the mandatory as far as you RCUK are concerned.
Correct. Competent
delivery of CPR, defibrillation, AED, basic airway interventions, including bag mask ventilation and or supraglottic airway, skills required for immediate post-resuscitation care, and strongly recommended, although to be determined by local policy and clinical need, intravenous cannulation, intraosseous access, and drug administration. And local policy and clinical need would presumably include an organisation making sure that particular members of staff were skilled, for example, healthcare assistants, if they were the ones that were going to be staffing and or responding as and contemplated by point 1.
Correct.
That makes sense. It may also be an obvious point, but you stipulate that all facilities, as in you, RCUK, stipulate that all facilities must have access to an outside line.
Correct.
Can I ask you, please, then, to look at Section 7 of the standards, which I think begins, or we want to look at the middle of page 20, please. A slightly different aspect, and these are special circumstances, although the section is quite small. The standards indicate that organisations must have policies and procedures in place for resuscitation in special circumstances, e.g. blood loss due to trauma, suffocation, application of a ligature to the neck and hanging, self-harm, seclusion, rapid tranquilization, etc. Now, whilst I appreciate that is a non-exhaustive list by the etc., do you consider that drowning also might be a special circumstance?
Yes, it would be.
As outlined in paragraph 69 of your witness statement for those following, you indicate that the standard requires organisations to identify circumstances in which resuscitation may need to be adapted to the patient or clinical situation and to plan accordingly. And you indicate that it is intended to set organisational expectations for local policy, training, equipment and escalation, rather than reproduce detailed clinical guidance. In the supporting documentation, I think it's a little bit further down the page. Can we go down, scroll down a little bit? Yes, it's at the bottom there, isn't it? 5, which is a document you've produced as an exhibit. So as part of the supporting documentation to help healthcare providers in formulating these policies and procedures, you produce the European Resuscitation Council Guidelines for Resuscitation, which provides guidance on cardiac arrest in special circumstances. Now, I'm not going to produce that paper, ask you to look at it, because it's quite a dense paper, isn't it?
It is indeed, yes.
It's about
54 pages.
Pages long. And it sets out, doesn't it, various special circumstances, including asphyxia-induced hypoxia, ligature, choking, suffocation. I'm just selecting a few examples. It also includes electrolyte abnormalities, about which you gave evidence earlier, traumatic cardiac arrest from significant blood loss, cardiac arrest from poisoning, which would include overdose, special environments, which would have the section on drowning. Those kind of matters are covered in that paper. But it is, as you say, quite a dense paper. As you've already outlined in the earlier part of your evidence, emergencies arising in special circumstances in mental health inpatient units require special interventions sometimes. You're nodding, is that
correct,
yes?
yes, sorry.
We've already covered several times, if possible, as soon as the deterioration is identified.
Correct.
Can I just ask you this then? Given the importance of the adaptation for special circumstances in a mental health inpatient setting, and given the aim which we saw this morning of the quality standards is one of simplification, would it not be preferable, do you think, for RC UK to provide at least some further guidance around special circumstances?
So we do. We've got that published within our resuscitation guidelines. So within that, there is a chapter specifically referenced as special circumstances, and it's based on the European Resuscitation Council guidelines. And what we would do is we would direct people who want the full science behind those recommendations to the European Resuscitation Council guidelines, because that's where we derive ours from. So we've got them. Sorry, we've got the guidelines published. They're just not within the quality standards.
Moving to a slightly different topic, if I may, restrictive interventions, and we've touched on these already, and we've already looked at the standard which says, and I'm not going to ask anybody to go back to it, that RC UK's immediate life support ILS course is recommended as a minimum standard for staff who deliver or are involved in rapid tranquilization, physical restraint and seclusion. And the foundation to this is referenced in the CQC's brief guide, which is called Immediate Life Support Training for Services that May Use Restrictive Interventions. Correct. And that in its turn refers to the NICE guideline, which is NG10, which was published, I think, May 2015. The Violence and Aggression Short-Term Management in Mental Health and Community Settings. And the point, I think, that from all of those documents is that if an organisation is asking whether they've got sufficiently trained staff, the question they should ask themselves is, are all relevant clinical staff trained in BLS and CPR? And all staff who may deliver or be involved in restrictive interventions trained in ILS?
Correct.
And so, again, just to underline, ILS training is considered a minimum standard for those who may be involved in restrictive interventions.
Correct.
And we talked a little bit around the physical health aspects, etc., early this morning. Given that cardiac arrest in healthcare settings is often secondary to another event, and observing deterioration and intervening promptly is particularly necessary, and we've been through all of that, where staff are carrying out rapid tranquilization, physical restraint and using seclusion, is there need for even greater focus then on monitoring for signs of deterioration?
So once they've certainly given that tranquilization, yes.
Is this addressed in guidance, in RC UK guidance, the need for greater focus?
We don't have a section specifically on that, but that would be part and parcel of if you were to give someone one of those drugs, about how you manage the administration of that pharmacological agent.
Might it be sensible to address it in the guidance?
We can certainly add it.
And I don't want to go through it again because I think you've already recognised it could apply to healthcare assistants if they were doing that role. Are there any local circumstances that would override the need to ensure that staff, including healthcare assistants, tasked with monitoring patients subject to restraint or in seclusion, are trained in ILS?
Sorry, could you say
I
that
think,
again?
yes, I can see. Are there any local circumstances that could override that requirement, that minimum standard of ILS-trained staff when monitored?
I mean, the basis would be if they, for levels of training, the organisation would be expected to do a detailed risk assessment, looking at where the risk lies and how they can mitigate and reduce that, and that should inform the training needs analysis. If an organisation has identified that individuals should have a certain level of training and choose not to follow it, then they really need a good, clear governance process as to why they're deviating from that risk they've identified. If they fail to identify the risk, that's where national standards and guidelines, such as the quality standards, can help them with that decision-making sort of pathway to say that individuals should require a level of training. But organisations really do need to be clear about why, and if they've identified the need for that level of training, they really should follow it.
So a risk assessment would need to be carried out. So if in fact an organisation had in some way misinterpreted those guidelines as indicating that what they needed was access to BLS-trained staff, not ILS-trained staff. Firstly, would that be a concern?
It would be, and that's part of the rationales that the governance structure have those experts in resuscitation or access to those experts in resuscitation to help guide them with that thought decision process. It needs to be a group decision in that sort of sense by the resuscitation committee to really make those recommendations.
Can I move on to asking you a little bit about scenario-based training and simulation? It's clear from your witness statement that you consider, or I say you, RCUK, consider it's of particular importance that those working on mental health inpatient units, and indeed other specific settings, are trained and practiced in responding to special circumstances, the type of scenarios that we've just been through. I think you've explained that your ILS training is not mental health specific, but I think you've explained that things can be added. In your earlier evidence, you said that there are course providers that can add to or can bring in certain elements to the training.
So
Did I understand that correctly?
For our ILS course, we do have mental health related scenarios.
Yes, I'm going to come on to those in a moment, but in terms of specific skills, the ILS training is ILS training, and then you add the scenarios and
standardised level of skill set, yes.
And in fact, just picking up on what you said, and your witness statement makes clear, it's, I think, around about, would it be the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, RCUK identified the need for specific mental health-based scenario training to be added.
Correct.
And I won't take it to you in detail, but it's for those following it, at paragraph 92 of your second witness statement, you say that RCUK has developed mental health specific ILS course materials and simulation scenarios for healthcare professionals working in mental health inpatient settings, which include scenario-based training content, assessment materials to assess those who undertake it, and instructor resources tailored to mental health environments.
Correct.
And I think we can probably summarise it in this way. It was developed through your ILS subcommittee at the beginning of 2019.
Correct.
It was drafted and then piloted at 3 mental health trusts.
Correct.
You received feedback.
Correct.
I think took some, didn't take some.
Correct.
And then issued those particular scenarios, I think in about July 2019.
Correct.
And I think you also explain at your paragraph 92 that there's been subsequent revisions and updates.
Correct.
Is that both to those materials and the ILS training?
It's predominantly to make the course content align with the changes in resuscitation guidelines.
You say in your paragraph 92 that development of the mental health specific ILS training involved input from subject matter experts and clinicians experienced in mental health resuscitation training. Now, we know you were involved in that. You were involved in that committee. Who were the subject matter experts and clinicians?
So we had 2 people within the actual group who deliver training regularly to mental health organisations. One of them was owned a private private training company who would deliver RCUK ILS courses, and was very familiar with risk management governance within mental health hospitals. We also approached, as I say, for the piloting, for 3 sites who were delivering a lot of ILS training, and asked them to give comments and feedback on their experience of using material and where adjustments may need to be made. So we had quite an extensive bit of feedback from experts in the area.
All right. Can I just ask you then a little bit about your ILS training? I think you gave evidence this morning that there is an e-learning part, is that right? And then there's a practical face-to-face part.
We've got several modalities for delivering the content. So one is a full-day programme, which is a combination of lectures, skills, and then that's embedded within simulation practice. We have recognising that organisations are time poor with clinicians and don't want to take them away from direct patient care for a whole day. We developed the e-ILS course. So the theory and content is delivered via e-learning. So when they come to the day for hands-on training, they can focus on skills and scenarios.
Would your preference, would RCUK's preference be that all staff should be trained face-to-face in an ideal world?
So they still do get face-to-face training.
Certainly for part of it.
For part of it, and that's the skill element where it's much more technical, and the management of the cardiac arrest. But the theoretical element is an easy part to move on to e-learning. Essentially, we moved the lecture component onto interactive e-learning, which allows learners to learn at their own pace. It gives them the opportunity to test their knowledge. So from an educational viewpoint, it's a lot more interactive and a lot more engaging for the learner.
Can I ask you this? Is there any way in your course materials of making sure that an individual is undertaking their own training? Do you know what I mean by that? Verification.
Everything is tracked. If you want to go into the nitty-gritty of can we guarantee the person's doing their own learning?
And not somebody else's, yes.
No, we can't. However, to get the qualification, it's on their performance on the day. So what they're assessed by the instructor as learning those skills.
And if they've done the e-learning, they still do a full day, do they?
They do a half day.
They do a half day.
Yeah.
How would you say that your ILS training addresses the ability of mental health inpatient workers to use it, once they've done it, promptly, accurately and confidently? The inquiry's heard evidence of chaos and uncertainty. What is it about your ILS training that overcomes that?
That's a good question to ask. Cardiac arrests by nature, as we've already mentioned, are the ultimate medical emergency. They are scary, they are frightening when they happen. It does get a little bit chaotic at times because people don't see them that often. What the trainer tries to do is enable that person who's going to be leading the event of the cardiac arrest in the first instance to try and gain that element of leadership and control by using technical and non-technical skills of leadership. So having more situational awareness, looking at how they're communicating to individuals, having good task allocation, which might actually also mean sending extra people who have turned up away, because what often happens in these situations where they happen so infrequently, you find people come out of the woodwork to get involved, and actually then it becomes managing crowds and the situation. So that the ILS course in that first instance gives a structure for the team leader to follow. It gives a structure for team members to follow as well. So they're all singing from that same hymn sheet, which enables that confidence to be delivered. The challenge with training, and this is for any course, not just an RCUK course, is you can deliver the skills and knowledge at a time, and we recommend, at least yearly training, but you need to have that embedded in other ways as well. So that familiarity is there if it should be called upon, so that people can guide themselves and reset to follow that set performer, as it were.
When you talk about embedded, would that be something in the order of drills on the ward or monthly drills? Or
drills are a really good example. So that's where you not only just test people's knowledge of enacting in a clinical scenario, you're also then simulating the processes around it. So are people familiar with they need to dial this number? Are switchboard then familiar with how they put the call out to the cardiac arrest team? If a patient needs to be transferred to a hospital via an ambulance, do they know whose responsibility that is? What number are they going to ring? Is it a 999? Do they have a dedicated number? Who's going to transport the patient? So you're actually testing not just the technical element, but the procedures and processes. And by adding that familiarity, you make things a lot more slick for the individual, and that reduces any potential for other sort of clinical misadvents to happen.
Can I just go back to your course content just on this particular topic? You have, I think, scenarios and simulations, if
Yes.
I've described them properly. In terms of we have seen your current course content, and can you confirm that the mental health scenarios included in your current course content are, I think, an acute asthma,
Yes,
a chest pain,
correct.
hypovolemia, if I pronounce that
Correct.
correctly,
Yes,
an anaphylaxis,
correct.
an asphyxiation following a ligature,
Correct.
and a hypoglycemia.
Correct.
So that's the range of circumstances, the scenarios. Does RCUK provide BLS training as well?
We are currently developing a basic life support level course. For the time of this investigation, we didn't have a BLS program.
Would BLS training ever include scenarios or the same sorts of scenarios?
Not typically, because BLS training tends to focus on the technical skills. So if people did frame it around a scenario, it'll all be very much the same. If there's a collapsed person, what are you going to do? And you ask them to go up, confirm cardiac arrest, put out a cardiac arrest call, start chest compressions, ventilate your patient and use an AED. So it doesn't go above and beyond sort of managing that and having that decision or thought-making process.
I've just been passed a post-it. We both need to slow down again, so no, it's my fault. I think you've already touched on this as well. Do you agree it's really important for staff that work together to train together as a team if possible?
If possible, it's beneficial. One of the challenges in all healthcare environments is understanding the level of training and knowledge that members who may respond have. So you can't assume that somebody will be trained to a much higher level just by their nature of their role or what they can or cannot do. So it's really important to have that. And actually within our standards, we recommend in all settings that you have a team huddle at the beginning of a shift to identify who's got what skills and can take on what role.
Moving to your simulations, or the purpose of simulation training, we won't look at them, but the purpose of simulations, I think you say within the document, is they're designed for healthcare professionals who may be called to act in the role of first to respond to a patient at risk of or in cardiac arrest.
Right.
The purpose of them. And your current simulations in your ILS course materials, I think there are 3 that arise from or are based around a patient with chest pain. Does that sound about right?
Correct.
There's one simulation which is based on a patient having been found in a bathroom having cut their wrists, I think with a razor.
Okay.
There is a 4th simulation which is an unresponsive patient who has been admitted with episodes or frequent episodes of overdose. So there's an overdose scenario. And I think the 6th is based on a patient being found unresponsive after having a ligature.
Correct.
Is that a correct summary of the 6 simulations? Bearing in mind that's if you like, the topics, those are the backgrounds of the simulation. Are you, RCUK, confident that your mental health specific simulations are comprehensive enough to cover all the special circumstance scenarios?
That would be challenging because we can't cover all of them. And the difficulty is finding that medium where you have physical health deterioration and also elements which are going to be more prevalent within that mental health environment, such as ligature. So we try to strike a balance, but the education within the program is transferable. So it's about understanding and having that systematic approach to the abnormalities that happen that you see when you look at stuff like vital signs or managing that cardiac arrest, and think how you're going to manage that. It has to be remembered that ILS is very much for those first few minutes or until that expert help arrives. So it's about stabilizing the situation. And you might then have to rely on expert help for managing the cardiac arrest, such as a cardiac arrest due to overdose is actually quite difficult to manage once they're in cardiac arrest, and that would require an advanced team in an acute hospital setting. But what we can do is give them the skills and knowledge to, as I say, take the ligature off, and if they're in cardiac arrest, then they just manage that in the format that the ILS gives them. It's a very transferable level qualification.
Okay. Can I just ask you some specific questions about the scenarios? So 3 of the scenarios, including the ligature scenario, include in the description of the patient reference to pallor.
Yes.
And as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, is pallor being used here to describe paleness?
So when we look at pallor, we certainly do. I'm just seeing if we've got the materials here. Can't see them. Yes, I'm certain. So you're looking at an element of perfusion can be seen in skin colouring. What we're very much moving to is we understand and very much are aware, and certainly this is a lot more prevalent in medical literature, that actually pallor is not necessarily a reliable indicator for individuals with certainly darker or skin tones and black skin tones. There are ways that we can assess elements of cyanosis, which is where you've got low blood oxygen levels because the pinker elements of skin, very much like the pink skin within your mouth, your mucosal membranes, will show that that's become a little bit bluish tinged. But we're moving very much away from using colour as an instigator for assessment because it's a poor indicator for darker skin tones.
That answers several more of my questions, in fact. So you're moving away from that because does your current training then not reflect those differences and those?
We have it as an awareness, but we also ask people not to rely on it, and we give that rationale as why you shouldn't rely on it either.
All right, so moving away from pallor, can I ask you about petechial marking? Do you agree that petechial marking, which sometimes occurs when someone has applied a ligature, is always also not as prominent on darker skin tones?
That is correct.
And you say you're moving away, and will then future RC UK material address the limitations, not only from pallor but also in relation to petechial markings?
Absolutely, and that's already in our course manuals.
And perhaps it follows then that you would agree that warnings should be incorporated as regard the limits of those sorts of visible checks, in particular pallor and bruising.
Absolutely.
Staying just with features particular to darker skin tones for a moment, do you also agree that darker skin tones do not prevent oximeter machine readings, but that those readings can overestimate blood oxygen levels in people with darker skin tones?
That is correct, and there was a patient safety alert to that effect a good few years ago.
Is there anything within your literature or your training that covers that point and informs staff of the limitations and assumptions that should or shouldn't be made in relation to darker skin?
Yes, we have a paragraph relating to that within our assessment or recognition and management of the deteriorating patient chapters in our manuals.
At paragraph 13 of your witness statement, which is when you give some of your introductory remarks, you explain that the underpinning principles for CPR are consistent across patient groups. However, there are clinically important differences between adults and children and infants.
Correct.
Would you agree it's also important, certainly if you're considering early recognition as a fundamental principle, would you agree it's also important to address perceptual bias in recognising clinical signs in black and people with other darker skin tones?
Yes, and certainly that's within our course materials, and that goes across the board for any age of assessment.
You've already explained that you think monthly drills, or I think I may have said monthly, that drills are a good way of embedding the simulation or this simulated practice. I said monthly. How often would you say drills should be carried out?
Again, that'll be down to an organisation's choice, but more frequent is better than less frequent.
And would you agree that if a provider was going to be using unannounced simulations, that it would be important that they would, say, take place at different times of the day?
Absolutely. My personal preference is always unannounced, because when you tell people that you're going to do them, because the healthcare system is full of busy clinicians, by indicating that at a certain time, a certain day you're going to be doing this, people then opt out because of you're taken away from clinical care. But actually this is just as important as clinical care. So the unannounced element is much, much better for realism.
So day and night, ideally, and including agency or other temporary staff?
Anyone who would be working on that shift, if you put out an emergency simulation, they should take on a role within that simulation.
So they should be at weekends as well, for example?
Any time, because you're not just assessing clinical knowledge, you're assessing the robustness of the response system, which has to work 24/7.
In terms of frequency of training required for staff, I won't go back to it, but we've seen in the standards, I think that you've said at least yearly, or there's a yearly
Correct.
training and update. Again, the inquiry's heard evidence from a staff witness who considered, he thought that ILS should be done twice a year, because when you need to resuscitate, you only have one chance to get it right. And as mental health nurses, we don't need to resuscitate very often. We've come back down to that. Would you agree with that? Would you agree that twice yearly might be optimal?
For areas where they have low instances, we have to remember that skill does degrade over time if you're not using them. So having more frequent training would be beneficial to the workforce. What the duration of that training might look like, I would leave down to the organisation to decide.
So is that likely to feature in any review of your standards?
So we do say that at least yearly or more frequent depending on local need. And that training may not be a standard ILS course every 6 months, say, but it could incorporate other learning strategies and techniques to help reinforce that education.
So kind of refresher update.
Absolutely.
In the meantime. Other evidence the inquiry has received that in one particular case, 7 out of 10 staff members were not compliant with their mandatory training. In those sort of circumstances, might you consider even more regular training than twice yearly?
That's a great question, and one that NHS England are currently looking into themselves, about frequency of mandatory training and potentially reducing the amount of mandatory training that clinicians face. The challenge there is it's often not the willingness or unwillingness to attend the training. It's usually because there may be something like a staffing issue in the environment where it's then deemed it's not safe for an individual to go and attend their training, because patient clinical need will always take a priority. So there needs to be ways of looking at the system to enable that opportunity for those individuals to meet that training requirement.
I'm going to move off training for a moment now and just onto the most recent and up-to-date equipment and drugs lists. I'm not going to look through them in detail, but I just want to ask you one or two questions. That's your exhibit ABC6, if we could have that up, please, and on page 1. The first point is, in relation to drugs and equipment, is that service providers must ensure that their staff have immediate access to appropriate resuscitation equipment and drugs, which is perhaps an obvious place to begin. And I think it also goes on to say that the defibrillator sign should be used so that everybody knows where to find the defibrillator. I think you've already dealt with my next set of questions. If we look at 2, which is that all settings must have a means of calling for help, e.g. landline, telephone, internal, external, mobile telephone with reliable signal or alarm bell. And you've already given evidence that should be very much part of any drill or process so that people understand how that works.
Correct.
You don't, as in RC UK, you don't mandate a mobile telephone, do you?
No, we don't. We have it as an option if that works for the local environment, but we're very acutely aware that mobile phone technology may not work in every environment, but as long as the organisation has a robust way of summoning help that works, is tested, and if it fails, they have a robust system in place to still enable that emergency response. That's the key thing.
Yes, it's a means for calling for help, and all staff need to know what it is.
Absolutely.
If it's a phone, it may sound obvious, but where that phone is, the number to call,
Correct.
the number to call if there's an outside line required. And can I ask you this? Whilst you don't mandate a mobile phone, it's important, isn't it, that the phone is portable, that it can be carried to the site of the patient?
If that's a requirement of the organisation, absolutely. One of the challenges with portable phones is they need to be charged. So at some point, that device itself needs to be plugged in, which means you may not be able to take it around with you. So not every device works perfectly in that sort of sense. But as long as there is a system and process so that when an event happens, there's no delay in getting that response to, particularly if it's a 999 response centre, that you are able to give that correct information to the call handler who can send the most appropriate response to the individual.
So that was what I was going to ask. How can that be done if the phone or the person on the phone isn't with the patient?
Mobile phones aren't without their risks in mental health hospitals, and that's the challenge we have to think about, the risk benefit for if you've got a device with you, which could then become problematic for delivering patient care. It's all very much down to that localised risk assessment. Some organisations have emergency call bell buttons which go straight through to an emergency service. Others may have that 2222 system and strategically placed phones within the vicinity. It's just about having that knowledge and awareness of that process on how quickly to get that response out.
But you don't
in
think
a safe environment.
But you don't think it is essential for a person to be able to take instructions from, for example, the ambulance services with the patient?
But again, they certainly can do, and depending on the situation, they should do. But that's why you need that that ILS sort of level clinical response. We could be maintaining elements of resuscitation. The ambulance service will provide more advanced level resuscitation, which may be out of the skill set of the individuals to deliver. So the call handler wouldn't be instructing people to do advanced level resuscitation over the phone, but as long as that message goes to the call dispatch that there is a cardiac arrest and therefore that rapid response ambulance can be sent to your location, that's the key thing. But it's minimising that time from recognition to placing that call.
I understand.
That's where the gap sort of needs to be shortened.
You've already given evidence that people should know, and in fact you've suggested a huddle at the beginning of a shift, that people know whose responsibility is what, which presumably would include who's going to call 999 or who's going to, which roles that people are going to assume. Should that also include who's going to let the paramedics in, for example, or who's going to do the door, or who knows the door code?
Absolutely. And those types of things don't need to be limited to clinical members of staff. That's how you can incorporate sort of ward clerks and ward administrators to help guide and support, because in some of these areas, particularly high sort of locked down areas within mental health hospitals, it's really important that part of the delay is not getting through the building to provide that life-saving support.
So there needs to be a process for that?
Yes.
All right. Again, jumping to a slightly different question and going to the equipment list, and this is at page 4 of your ABC 6. There we are. So this is the list of equipment suggested availability, and this is in the airway section, I think, for adults. And it suggests that ligature cutters should be immediately available on adult wards. As we can see, it's the number 1. Before I ask you about ligature cutters, why is there not a similar requirement for paediatric CAMS wards?
There should be, and that will be corrected.
And it will be corrected, you say?
It will be corrected.
Does RC UK consider that all staff should carry ligature cutters?
Again, it's that risk-benefit ratio in those areas where it's higher risk, either having identified in a key locations or key locations, there should be more than one, so you're not traipsing around a clinical area looking for the cutters, or absolutely it might be seen as appropriate for individuals to carry them as well. It's that risk-benefit ratio of, is it riskier holding a ligature cutter around in the area or not, essentially, depending on the patient cohort.
Are you able to give any information as to your view on what would be a key location for ligature cutters?
It depends on the local environment, but you would want it somewhere accessible and central and safe.
A further question, and I think it's on page 14, please, and this relates to drugs. This is where I think if no, it's the maybe I've. Where are we? Let me start by asking this question, and then we'll have a look at the second part. Naloxone is, I think, an accessible drug at the moment. Would RC UK consider revising the requirement for it to be accessible, for it to be immediate on mental health?
So the thing with naloxone has a short drug life anyway. So when you give it to a patient, you're going to need to give several and subsequent doses afterwards. So naloxone is a reversal agent for opiates, so morphine-based drugs. The reason it's there is because obviously it reduces your respiratory drive and makes your respiratory rate drop. You can counteract that and manage that by good quality ventilation before naloxone even becomes on scene. But certainly that's why it's accessible rather than immediate, because your first action would always be to ventilate that individual, to give them those breaths.
The part I wanted you to look at, on page 14, if you have it in front of you, is about the storage of drugs, because you give a little bit of information about that at paragraph 42 of your witness statement. And it's around keeping resuscitation drugs locked away. And we look at, it says when we look at point 3, it says when deciding how and where to store emergency drugs, a local risk assessment is required to balance the risk of access to drugs by patients and visitors against the risk of a delay in access to emergency drugs in emergency. That's probably self-explanatory. Sorry, it's now my fault. I need to slow down again. Apologies. I think you explain in your paragraph 42 that this reflects a concern that arose, I think, some time ago.
Correct. When
CQC inspectors advised that drugs on resuscitation trolleys should be locked away.
Correct.
And I think you responded to that, and now you suggest a local risk assessment because it's important that key drugs are, in fact, readily accessible and not locked away.
That's correct.
I think that can be taken down now. Thank you. Just moving on now to some, towards, you'll be relieved, some of the ends of the questions. Can I just ask you about the status of these standards? And we touched on this at the beginning. As you explain in your witness statement at paragraph 38, RC UK do not undertake direct distribution of these to NHS mental health trusts or to private mental health inpatient providers, or indeed any sort of NHS provider. Is that right?
Yes, so at the time that these were written, initially we had the organisation is small. We are a headcount of 40, which is very small for the remit that we cover. And also we're not a statutory, regulatory or accrediting body. So historically, our method of communication would be with our core audience of instructors who are predominantly would then be resuscitation officers or medics with that interest in resuscitation. We have a lot more, a better communications and engagement team, so that when we do this the next time round, so this year, we have a greater sort of contact list of people within NHS England and the other devolved nations who to contact. We would certainly contact the Royal Colleges. We would contact people like the British National formerly, medical health regulatory authorities. So we've got a much more bigger impact of people to contact to ensure that these get distributed within
so a much wider distribution for if they become the 2026 quality standards, the 2026 quality standards. We know, however, that you provide, I don't know if advice is the word you would use, but you've set out in your witness statement, paragraph 78, and you've been able to identify examples of when people have contacted RC UK for advice on interpretation of various guidance.
Correct, yes.
If you are approached, or if you were to be approached by individual wards or institutions, would you provide perhaps not training, but training or advice on the location and storage and contents of standard equipment, for example?
So that's not something we'd be able to provide over the phone. You really need to have a detailed assessment of the environment. If we were to receive an inquiry like that, what I would recommend is actually liaising with a local acute trust resuscitation team and asking one of those resus officers to go down, have a look and walk through the space with them so they can do that risk assessment together.
Right, so RUC UK wouldn't do it, but you might make suggestions of others where they could get the assistance. All right.
Correct.
So I think that perhaps answers my next question. So you yourself wouldn't go to specific wards, as in you, the organisation, not necessarily you yourself, to assess the requirement to have multiple grab bags or particular equipment on that ward?
No, that's outside of our remit,
All right.
unfortunately.
You also explain at paragraph 24 of your witness statement that you don't mandate the implementation of the standards.
Correct.
And you don't operate any formal compliance or accreditation or assurance process in relation to their adoption.
Correct. We are a non-statutory, non-regulatory body, so we have no jurisdiction in this field.
And so inspection and regulation of resuscitation and the provision relating to resuscitation sits with those who regulate healthcare more generally, so the CQC, NHS England to a certain extent, and those that regulate individuals, GMC, NMC, if you're dealing with
Correct.
particular individuals' actions. You make clear that whilst the CQC have reference to RC UK standards, and we've seen an example of that, or you've given evidence about an example of that, you don't have any involvement in CQC inspections.
No, we haven't.
Nor do you direct or inform CQC inspections?
We might get asked for our opinion on elements of what an assessment may or may not require. I can't think of any off my head, but it would be advice and guidance. If they chose to take that up, would be down to the CQC. Okay,
so they might ask you about what an inspection what might be required.
Correct.
Are there circumstances in which they might come back to you and say, this is what we found, what do you think about this?
To my knowledge, that's historically never happened within the organisation.
Do you think there's a role for an independent body to oversee the implementation of your standards?
I certainly do think there is an element for that. Resuscitation is one of those elements within healthcare which is so important and vital, recognising my own bias as a resuscitation specialist. But actually, it can often be almost a secondary thought. In certain cases, it's another thing we have to do in sort of training. But actually, if we want to make that change and increase survival, then having some form of monitoring system would be much, much more beneficial above and beyond what is sort of standard auditing at the moment.
And similarly then, and we've already seen, and you've given evidence about the fact that RC UK recognises challenges with the implementations of the standards in mental health inpatient settings. Would you consider there's a place for additional guidance and support for mental health inpatient settings as to how to implement your standards?
Certainly, that's something we can work with our community of practice to help give options and suggestions to individuals. But if there is a great and global error then, or challenge, then this is something that NHS England should be looking to help support and reduce that sort of inequality.
I suspect we'll be asked to slow down again in a moment, so no, it's my fault, so I'll go through the other questions slowly. In your view, what is the best way that a trust could be monitored regarding implementation, compliance, accreditation, both internally and externally?
Currently, I think that needs to sit with the CQC or NHS England.
I know you've indicated in evidence that it hasn't happened historically, but would you consider, and you've just told us you're a small number, 40, but would RC UK consider, if asked, providing representatives to join CQC on visits or inspections or to provide specific recommendations?
We would be more than happy to have conversations with them to help guide and advise. Within that organisational 40, I have a clinical team of about 6. So that would be a very difficult task for us to go and assess or go along with them to assess a part of their overarching assessment, because it is one little section, although be very, very important about the whole governance they're looking at for a hospital or clinical area. But we can certainly have those conversations about what a good assessment looks like and what should be happening.
And given the small number, I may know the answer to this next question, but do you consider it would be helpful if you did have some form of statutory power to ensure compliance with the guidance and the standards?
I would love that ability, but it's probably not within my gift to say yes or no without the trustees saying that. But I can certainly say that as we are the expert body in resuscitation within the UK, we would be ideally placed to help provide that level of assurance.
In terms of compliance, your standards record as a must, and we've been through this, action that healthcare staff receive resuscitation training at regular intervals. We've been through that. Again, turning that on your head, if staff who are working in, working in mental health inpatient units who are not up to date with their training remain on the wards, if that makes sense, whether that be ILS or BLS, would you consider that a breach of your standards?
Certainly, we would want enough training on that area to make sure it's safe for patient care.
That was my next
and
question.
That's the key thing. It's about safety.
Because it would create a risk to public safety, wouldn't it, in your view?
Exactly. And the kind of example I would give there is our certificates are dated. They're valid for a year. And someone who's 2 days out of that validation date suddenly wouldn't lose knowledge. So there's that mitigation sort of risk, whereas someone who may have not had training for 5 years, that would be a much greater concern. But it is about overarchingly maintaining that patient safety and being able to provide that appropriate response.
And finding the balance between the need for compliance with the mandatory resuscitation training, and you've already given evidence about this, with the need to ensure there are sufficient staffing levels.
Correct.
Even if those staff may potentially be out of date on their training?
The date element is really key, because you can be out of date 1 day post, or you can be out of date, as I say, 5 years, and that would be a much, much greater concern.
Okay. Would you consider issuing further guidance for trusts that disregard or that they don't use non-compliant staff?
That's a difficult question to answer, because again, it's about one element of their role against their whole role within that department. And by taking away somebody, you might then cause other issues and a clinical risk within that environment.
Do you provide any guidance on staffing levels and staff allocation?
We don't. That's outside of our remit.
Would you consider agency staff generally undesirable because of the risks around the training and the risks around the fact they haven't been training or haven't done the simulations with the team? Sorry, that was probably 2 questions in one.
And again, it's a difficult question to answer, because I don't think, I can't remember the wording used for the beginning part of that question, sorry, but I don't think agency staff are undesirable, again, because resuscitation is only one part of their role, whereas actually the needs of the environment can be quite great, so depending on what's needed on that ward area, and therefore they do serve a benefit. Agency staff keep the NHS afloat in a lot of clinical areas, and they're very much considered as part of a team. We know that teamwork works better in these sorts of skills and drills, as we talked about, when you're using the same people so they get used to the processes. And there can be a challenge if you have an outsider within that, or even a newly employed member within that area who's not familiar with those sorts of skills and drills or the procedures. But that's about making sure that the induction process to that area is robust.
I'm going to finish with just a couple of separate topics, and the first is the question of data collection. I think with reference to paragraph 114 of your statement, it's right that RC UK do not undertake monitoring of individual cardiac arrest incidents.
Sorry, say that again.
That you don't undertake monitoring of individual
Correct.
cardiac arrest incidents, but there are 2 bodies that do.
Correct.
The National Cardiac Arrest Audit and the Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest Outcomes Registry.
Correct.
And you've noted, I think, in your paragraph 135, a limitation in the availability of national data specifically relating to resuscitation events within standalone mental health inpatient environments.
That is correct.
Because there's no body that's with a remit for collating or analysing that data.
There's no body, but there's also challenges in, if I look at the National Cardiac Arrest Audit, their criteria for entry onto the audit criteria, mental health hospitals, unless they're part of an acute hospital site, they may not get entry onto the register. So there does need to be a specific way of gathering and collecting information for this patient cohort, certainly.
I mean, the long and short of it is that at the moment, the trends and outcomes of cardiac arrests in mental health inpatient units cannot easily be analysed.
That's correct.
And they can't be compared really with either the OHCAO registry or the NACCC
Correct.
registry. Okay. Audit and review. I won't ask that it be put up for speed purposes, but Section 12 of the quality standards relates to audit and reporting after a CPR event. And Standard 2 provides that all CPR attempts must be reviewed. When appropriate, a root cause analysis must be undertaken and the action plan implemented. A suggested guide for reviewing cardiac arrests is available in the supporting tools below. Now, can you confirm that the supporting tool, in fact, is the tool that refers on the that appears on the next page? And that if the answer to any of the questions in that supporting tool raises a concern, the tool recommends a full root cause analysis and action plan?
Correct.
None of the questions expressly state or suggest that immediately following the event, an accurate and detailed record should be made of the timings of key events, such as when the patient was found, when the emergency alarm was activated, when an AED was applied, etc. Do you have detailed guidance on what information should be recorded immediately after event?
There should be elements about what to document during a cardiac arrest, which goes through those processes, because that forms part of your requirements as a healthcare professional for documenting the legal requirement for documenting the care you give during an event. So there are elements within the quality standards which say about the location, time, onset of rhythm, what drugs were given, CPR started, all those types of things, and along with any other pertinent medical history.
They don't reference what I'm going to call preservation of evidence or of items, so CCTV, other recordings, retention of the ligature.
No.
Do you think they should?
That's a good question. If it's there and it is relevant to the patient's medical records, absolutely. Certainly the preservation of a knot for a ligature is often quite important, but there's no reason, as long as it fits within the requirements of GDPR in that sort of sense, you're not monitoring other patients, that there's no reason why it can't be put into a medical note as a reference.
And do you think guidance might be of assistance in that regard?
It could be. It's outside of our sort of scope of practice to say what should or shouldn't in that sort of sense, but it's something that could be looked into.
Have you considered developing specific quality standards or guidelines for auditing resuscitation attempts?
We have some guidance within the quality standards, but we don't have a set national standard for the requirements for audit. That very much sits either with the national cardiac arrest audit or the out-of-hospital cardiac arrest audit. But they do follow a set template called the Utstein template or formula, which looks at the rhythm, if you've got return spontaneous circulation, survival to discharge, and those types of things. So there are sort of recommendations in other documentation.
In terms of review and audit, can I just ask about what you would expect to happen immediately after a cardiac arrest on a mental health inpatient ward? Are you aware of the concept of a hot debrief?
Hot and cold debriefing, yes.
Can you explain in a sentence what a hot debrief is?
So a hot debrief is one that's done directly after the event. It's a touch base just to either have a quick lessons learned about what's happened, to look at what's going to happen next, restocking of the trolley, these types of things that need to happen immediately. That then feeds into the cold debrief, which often usually happens afterwards and is much more structured and organised. And that's where you start looking at the detailed root cause analysis about what was going on with the patient, were there signs of deterioration, were there sort of organisational or was it healthcare related instances which may have contributed to the cardiac arrest that we know of. And so we look to identify that where errors may have happened to try and reduce them, but also look for areas of good practice to reinforce those going forward.
That's a kind of a wider ward level debrief?
Much more in depth,
right.
Looking at the ward and procedures.
Do you then consider that any learning from cardiac arrest events should be disseminated to all the staff at there?
Absolutely.
Do you have any opinion or views as to the best way of sharing learning in that sense?
very much depends again on the organisation. Very acutely aware that if people just send constant emails about learning, they may or may not get read. So it depends on what works well for that organisation. Do they have regular team huddles? Do they have ward-based team meetings where information and learning can be shared? Kind of depends on the communication system that works better for that hospital.
Have you ever considered recommending that organisational audits are shared with you, your RCUK, so that you can track national learning from cardiac arrest incidents on mental health inpatient wards?
Not something we've considered, but again, we don't collect data on what, sort of those sort of granular stuff from individual organisations. We look at sort of wider published data. But if there were a national audit set up, then that would be something we would be keen to look into.
Just then coming to the end of the questions I have to ask you, you've already given evidence that the quality standards are being reviewed this year.
Correct.
You've already alluded to changes and matters that are going to be addressed as part of that process. How dramatically do you expect those standards to change then when they're reviewed?
A good question. When we, as an example, when we update our clinical guidelines, we give organisations up to a year to get them embedded. Generally, that's our recommendation. We'd probably follow suit with clinical quality standards. The reason being, if there's a change in policy, that needs to be learnt and disseminated, and education needs to happen across an organisation. Because if we change a document and an organisation changes it, we need to make sure the people on the shop floor, so in those wards and clinical areas, know what's happened and what's changes and what's why. So we'd need to give time and flex for that to happen, but I would certainly expect it to change within a year.
Within a year. At paragraph 134 of your witness statement, and you've alluded to this as well as we've gone through your evidence, you set out that RCUK recommends that the ongoing NHS England review of statutory and mandatory training requirements should consider ILS training as a minimum standard within inpatient mental health facilities proportionate to local risk assessment and service configuration.
Correct.
Why do you consider it's important that that NHS England review considers this change in minimum standards specifically?
So the NHS review, NHS England review, they're looking at mandatory training across the board, and part of that is also looking at resuscitation training. And what we want to ensure that quality isn't dropped and it doesn't become an exercise of where everyone then just learns about basic level life support, but we want to ensure that safety is paramount within the workforce. So we want to ensure that clinicians have that understanding of recognition of a deteriorating patient. We want them to be able to provide good quality or high quality CPR and safe defibrillation. ILS for us as an organisation really is that standard about how you manage the event locally to help support the team before the more advanced team arrive. And taking elements of that away would actually possibly compromise patient care. So, and certainly when we look at all the stuff we've talked about today, particularly when we look at tranquilization and stuff, that's the element and standard we would want to maintain and deliver.
And would that include healthcare assistants then, in terms of a recommendation that all clinical staff or frontline staff are provided with that ILS training?
If it's appropriate for their clinical role, absolutely.
If it's appropriate for?
Their clinical role.
I'm just a bit struggling a bit as to where you land on all of this, because earlier you had implied that you weren't actually pressing for ILS for all healthcare assistants, other than those with an interface with patients. In a mental health setting, can you envisage... Can you actually envisage that there wouldn't be a necessity for all healthcare assistants, given what you've told us? to be trained ILS standard?
As I say, it very much depends on what their clinical role is within that organisation. Because what we certainly understand is that the role of a healthcare assistant can be very varied depending on where they work and what their role is and what they're doing. Certainly if there's an expectation for them to be involved with managing or supporting a deteriorating patient, or even the people recognising that deterioration has happened because they are the only person looking after that individual whilst being supported by the team, then absolutely, certainly. If there is a broader requirement that actually says for safety element for all patients that it should be a global, everyone should have ILS, and we'd be very, very supportive of that. But we recognise that not every healthcare assistant works in the same sort of way across the organisations, depending on what their clinical role is.
Okay.
But what I wouldn't want to do is disadvantage patient care by saying that everyone needs training, which could also then become a bottleneck into training, but also by not allowing people to access training who should be or shouldn't be. If that makes sense.
It does, but could I pick up and ask this then? Would you say that everybody needs ILS training if they are potentially a first responder?
Yes, that is a very reasonable request, yes.
And could you make that recommendation even if NHS England didn't?
We certainly would do. Our position wouldn't change. You know, in that sense, we will happily make recommendations to training, to practice, to clinical guidelines, even if there were changes within NHS England which may go against that sort of recommendation. But we're working with them to help guide and advise and support, so hopefully that wouldn't be the situation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benson-Clark. That's all my questions, unless, Chair, you have anything else you would like to.
No.
What happens now is that we have a 10-minute break to see if there's any questions from any others that have arisen during the course of your evidence. And if there are, we'll come back. And if there aren't, we won't. And so I will say thank you very much for helping us today.
And I'd like to reiterate those thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Benson-Clark. Two short matters. The first matter is returning to your evidence about skin colour or darker skin colours and pallor and petechial markings being a poor indicator or not being a reliable indicator in persons of darker skin tones. In terms of your current training materials, do any of those training materials make those limitations clear?
It's within our course manuals that they are limitations. We go into quite some detail. The challenge within course materials is that a lot of the mannequins are historic and they're very Caucasian looking. Manufacturers are bringing out more different coloured mannequins to reflect proper skin tones. So essentially, the scenarios become quite generic in that sort of sense because it's disrespectful and a little bit discoherent to say that I want you to imagine this white mannequin in front of you is a different shade than what we would like it to be, and recognising that actually that does patients a massive disservice. So once the equipment matches up with the requirements, we will certainly be able to do that.
And you've already indicated that you're moving away from that in any event, and I think you indicated that future materials are likely to be updated, or future standards are likely to be updated.
Absolutely, much more reinforcement of that as a sign that people need to be much more acutely aware of.
All right, and is there any more that should be done before updating those materials?
As I say, it's within our course manuals, which every candidate who's on a course gets. And as we go through those detailed assessments, we talk about differences within skin tone. Anaphylaxis is a great example where you might get hives and flushing on the skin. Well, that's not going to be present. So we talk about how to spot different signs and symptoms to confirm your diagnosis.
Slightly separate topic. The standards do not mandate that a doctor on call, or indeed any healthcare professional on a ward, should hold the ALS qualification. But appears to assume a prompt response by ambulance crewed with a paramedic. And we've already heard, you've given a lot of evidence about how, particularly given the geographical location of mental health inpatient care, the prompt response, apologies, or the expert help is likely to be paramedics, ambulance service, or perhaps a resuscitation team if co-located. Do you have any concerns about the fact that the standards don't mandate that the doctor on call should hold an ALS qualification? Or do you think in the circumstances, and given the particular circumstances of a mental health inpatient unit, that at least someone on duty should have the ALS qualification, which allows for advanced airway management, for example, in case there is a delay in the ambulance or designated resuscitation personnel attending?
So what we do say within the quality standards, it's within the training. Training staff section 3.21, that members of mental health resuscitation teams that have specific involvement in resuscitation, particularly team leaders, require a level of training above and beyond provided by local ROs. These people should be encouraged to attend a nationally recognised course such as advanced life support. So we do make the provision that if you're going to be the team leader of a cardiac arrest and you've got that advanced level of expectation of advanced level skills, such as like being a doctor, then you certainly should have that ALS level training. But
that's a slightly different question, isn't it, than this one, which is, do you think that a person with that level of training there should always be a person, I may have asked it badly, that there should be at least somebody on duty on the ward or in that mental health inpatient setting who has that level of qualification, given the challenges in getting expert help in?
Certainly there should be someone, if you're having a cardiac arrest team for the hospital, then you should have someone with that level of qualification.
Again, I don't think that's the question. The question is, given that in mental health inpatient care, you are more often than not, or certainly very often, relying on a 999 telephone call or a team coming in from another location, in those circumstances, do you consider that there should be one person on duty in the unit who has got that advanced level training?
When you say unit, do you mean the
mental health inpatient
the
unit?
Ward or the hospital?
Well, if it's different, isn't it? Because you're talking about a hospital, I suppose, if they're co-located. I'm asking you if it's a mental health inpatient unit, which is not co-located with acute clinical setting, and therefore there may be a delay in the expert team arriving. In those circumstances, what would RCUK's view be on whether there should be a person on that unit on duty as part of the staffing rota with that ALS training?
So sorry, my clarifying point was that they're often not isolated wards. When they're in their own mental health facility, you might have several wards together, and it's whether or not you're saying that they should have one person on every shift in the ward or within the building at a time.
Within the building, it's my fault.
So certainly I would say that would be one of our highly recommended elements that the medical cover certainly could do and should do, recognising that within their training they would have gone through acute care, an element within, and therefore that would be appropriate level for them.
Thank you. Those are my additional matters. Chair, did you have any?
No, thank you very much.
I'm asked now if we can have a break until 3:40, at which point the evidence of Beverly Switzer will be paid.
Thank you.
Played, sorry.
Thank you very much indeed.
Good afternoon. Chair, this afternoon we are playing the evidence of Beverly Switzer, Member of Staff at EPUT. Ms Switzer has given all evidence to the inquiry by way of a pre-recorded session which you granted on the basis of special measures. Please could we play the video?
Thank you.
Could you read the words of the affirmation?
I, Beverly Switzer, do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Could I remind you to please keep the pace slow so that the stenographer can transcribe the proceedings? Thank you. Could you state your full name for the record, please?
Beverly Susan Switzer.
And you have provided one witness statement to the inquiry dated the 7th of June 2026. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
Correct.
And the final page of that statement, page 8, bears your signature and a statement of truth.
No signature.
Your signature has been redacted.
Okay.
But you confirm that that is your signature, that is your statement.
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to read it recently?
Not recently.
Do you confirm that the contents of the statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
To my belief, yes.
And are you content for that statement to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
Sorry?
Are you content for the statement to stand as your evidence to the inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. I will start by asking you questions about your qualifications and your experience. You say at paragraph 2 of your witness statement that you currently work within EPUT Dementia Services.
Correct.
Is that correct? And at paragraph 5, you say that you started working at EPUT Community Dementia Services in 2022. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Do you recall what month you began working at that service?
To be honest, no. I keep thinking, was it the August or was it the February around that time? I think it might have been the February, March time.
Thank you. What is your role? What is your current role within EPUT Community Dementia Service?
I am a healthcare assistant as well as now being a apprentice nursing associate.
And as a healthcare assistant, what kind of tasks do you undertake in your role?
I generally do the initial memory monitoring, and that is monitoring medication that patients have been put on after having a diagnosis of dementia. It's also to see how they're doing, how the families are doing, whether they need extra support with OT referrals, adult social care referrals, if they're having any side effects with their medication, if there's any behavioural issues that we can refer to the dementia services, the DST office, or even the intensive support team. And I also do ECGs.
And when you say the DST office, what is...
Dementia support team.
Thank you. Prior to your role, your current role, you worked at the Peterborough ward, didn't you?
Correct.
And you worked there, you began working there in August 2020.
Correct.
What was your role there?
Healthcare assistant.
And at that ward, what types of tasks did you undertake as a healthcare assistant?
Physical observations, level 1s, 2s and 3s, obviously engaging with patients, supporting them if they need any support with personal care, being a voice for them if they needed to speak up but didn't feel like they could.
Thank you. The focus of my questions today would be about your time at the Peterborough ward. Before I move on to my next set of questions, I'll just like to remind you again to keep the pace slow for the benefit of the stenographer. Thank you. Prior to working on the Peterborough ward, I note from paragraph 3 of your statement that you say you were a senior healthcare assistant at Cambion Fairview, which is now Signet Care. Is that right?
Correct.
I note that you were a senior healthcare assistant there. Did you have experience prior to working in that role?
In what, within Cambion?
Within healthcare?
Yes. I've been doing healthcare since 1997, and that was with mainly learning disabilities, autism.
And was that similarly as a healthcare assistant?
Yes.
Thank you. And so you have substantial experience as a healthcare assistant?
Yes.
Thank you. Turning now to the Peterborough ward, what type of ward was it? Was it an acute ward, an inpatient ward? And what types of patients did you see on that ward?
It was, when I first started there, it was an assessment ward. It was originally designed as an assessment ward. So patients would come in, they'd be assessed, and then as to whether they were to go home with treatment or whether they were to be forwarded onto a different ward for longer term care.
And were these both male and female patients?
Male and female, yes.
And do you remember what the size of the ward was? How many beds were on the ward?
I think it's 17 or 18 bedded ward. And we also had like an isolation bit as well. Like it's not, it's like the only way I can describe it is like a seclusion bit where someone that was, the people that I saw going there that were violent, aggressive and things like that.
And you've mentioned that it was designed to be an assessment ward, and you say at paragraph 6 of your witness statement that due to lack of available beds on longer stay wards, patients would be there for longer than planned.
Yes.
In your experience, how long were patients typically admitted onto the ward?
It varied from patient to patient. I knew of patients that had been there a few weeks. I know of patients that had been there for a few months. The longest patient I can recall is 9 months.
In your experience, if it was functioning as an assessment unit as designed, how long would you have expected patients to remain on the ward?
This is my own personal preference, I must add, but you'd expect a week, sort of like 7 days, because then a bed may have become available for them to go into, or they're getting the right treatment into place for them to be able to return to their own home.
What impact did these extended stays by patients have on the ward in terms of patient care and, for example, the availability of therapeutic activities for them and planning discharge?
Once again, it's individualised, isn't it, to each patient, I believe. I've only ever worked on the Peterborough. I've never worked on any of the longer term wards. So I don't know what benefits they would get on the longer term wards. I can only go by my experience, so I honestly couldn't answer that.
Thank you. The inquiry has heard evidence from Zoe Bunting, and she was the ward manager at the Peterborough unit from November 2020, and she became acting matron, in 2022. And so is it correct that she was the ward matron or ward manager or acting matron for the majority of the period that you were working on the Peterborough ward?
Yes.
Thank you. I will now ask you some questions about therapeutic activities and care planning. At paragraph 8 of your witness statement, you say there were OT activities, so occupational therapy activities, throughout the week. Can you describe the range of activities that were available to patients on the ward?
It would be things to engage them, like ping pong ball. They'd be doing that, arts and crafts, and I would say mainly it was around the arts and crafts more so than anything.
And how frequently were these activities available for patients to access?
There was, I can recall there used to be an activity list, weekly activity list put up on the board Monday to Friday, but there was times, you know, if the occupational therapist was off sick, these activities wouldn't happen.
Yes, and the inquiry has in fact heard evidence from Zoe Bunting to say that the activity timetable was impacted by the availability of occupational therapy staff. What impact the non-delivery of therapeutic activities have on the patients on the ward?
Individualised once again. It's, you know, with some, we try and find something else for them to do. You know, there's people that would purchase their own diamond art. So, you know, us as healthcare assistants, if we could, we'd engage with them with playing cards, you know, inviting them to do their diamond art within the communal area. And trying to, you know, obviously they were upset at the fact that what they were expecting wasn't happening, but it was obviously out of our control, so we try as healthcare assistants to put something else in place, but obviously with shortage of staff and everything, it's not always possible to give them that engagement in that way. That's why the occupational therapy people used to come in, to be able to do that.
Zoe Bunting has told the inquiry that she noted a significantly improved atmosphere on the ward when the activity programme was fulfilled. Is that consistent with your experience?
Yes, because it gave them something to look forward to.
Thank you. Turning now to care plans, you say at paragraph 21 of your witness statement that care plans were person-centred. The inquiry has heard evidence that in practice, care plans were sometimes completed without input from patients or from their families, sometimes because of staffing pressures. Were you aware that sometimes it was not possible to involve patients and their families in care planning?
If the patient wasn't engaging, because sometimes you get patients that were coming onto the ward and they didn't want to engage. So then it became traditional planning. But obviously when they're on the ward, we would, if there was, you know, if they had a decision whether to take any medication that was prescribed for them, it was their choice to say, no, I don't want it. But I was never involved in any of the planning at all. It was just we were able to read up the care plans once they were in place.
You refer to traditional planning. What do you mean by that?
Traditional, there's two types of care planning. You've got person-centred and you've got traditional, which is what the professionals do. They come in, right, this person needs that, they need that, they need that. So that is traditional. Person-centred is where the person is the one that puts their input as well. Everybody is involved.
Are you aware of circumstances where the care planning wasn't person-centred as a result of factors other than that the patient themselves weren't engaging? So, for example, were there circumstances where traditional care planning had to be undertaken because of pressures on staff?
I can't answer that one because I never was involved with the actual care planning.
Thank you. You say that care plans were updated by nursing staff, and you've just told me that you weren't involved in that. What arrangements were made to ensure that you, as a healthcare assistant, knew about changes to risk assessments, for example, or updates to the care plan?
Handovers, or if you was on shift and something happened where a risk assessment had to be altered, we would be told.
And so when you say at paragraph 22 of your statement that any changes or concerns regarding a patient's care plan being updated were always handed over from shift to shift,
yeah.
Is that what you mean?
Yes.
That updates and anything that you needed to know as a healthcare assistant regarding the care to be provided to a patient would be told to you at handover?
At handover, yes.
You also say that care plans were easily accessed via the record system on the ward. In practice, did you have time to review patient care plans?
Not always, no.
And how often would you review a patient's care plan in full?
Me personally, if a new patient came on, I'd look at their care plan when it was all up on the system, and obviously just to see for myself. But to look at it again with updates, I would say I wouldn't look for updates. They were handed over.
And in terms of not looking for updates, is the reason why you wouldn't look for updates that you would expect that any updates would be provided to you verbally, or were there other factors such as not having the time to read updates to the care plans?
Sometimes it was not having the time to actually sit there and read the updates. But generally, it was because it was handed, it would be handed over from shift to shift.
And how, in your experience, how full were those handovers from shift to shift? Were you able to get all of the information? In your experience, did you get all of the information that you required in relation to the updates that may have been made to a patient's care plan?
I'll be totally honest. The handovers was half an hour long, and I do personally feel sometimes that wasn't long enough to get a full spec of what had happened from the previous shift or from the previous few days, because you'd be more mindful that the previous shift were waiting to go. So it's like sometimes it could have been, I feel it could have been a bit rushed.
And were other matters discussed at those handovers other than changes to care plans?
It was about how the patient's presentation had been, how they'd been within the last 24 hours generally, or if there was something important that we still needed to know on a daily, that was left on the handover, or we were advised, to have a look at anything that we needed to look at. But that was generally would be for the nurses on shift more than the HCAs.
And in relation to observations, did you rely on the information from these handovers, or would you go to the care plans as part of your observations?
What do you mean? Sorry.
So in conducting observations, for example, would you look to care plans, or would you rely on the information that you obtained from handovers?
me personally would rely on information at handovers.
Thank you. I will now turn to asking you about safety on the ward. You have explained at paragraph 20 of your statement that you had no concerns about patients feeling safe because no safety concerns were raised with you. Were you aware of any formal processes, for example, patient meetings, community meetings, through which patients were encouraged to raise their concerns about safety on the ward?
There was, I don't know whether it was daily or whether it was weekly, but there used to be what they called patient huddles, where patients could get together and talk about any concerns that they had, you know, quite freely. And, you know, if patients came up to us with concerns themselves individually, then we would either ask them or make them feel comfortable to address them to the ward manager. And, you know, this is me personal, I would advise them, you know, if they want me to support them, I'll come in there with them. But I've never had any patient say that they didn't feel safe.
And how frequently did the patient huddles take place?
I can't recall if it was daily or weekly.
Who organised them?
The ward manager.
And how well do you think that forum worked in terms of patients raising their concerns and those concerns being addressed?
There was never anybody come back to me to say, well, I don't think anything's going to be done about that. The ward manager would always, everything would be written down and she would investigate, you know, if it was little things, and like, generally it was about food and stuff like that. You know, they're not getting enough food choices, and that's from what I can recall.
Thank you. And I'm only asking about your personal experience.
Okay.
You say at paragraph 35 of your statement that a patient's threat to self-harm were always treated seriously. How frequently did you observe patients threatening self-harm?
Depending on what patients were in. You know, it's once again, you could, I would say weekly you'd have someone that was threatening, so it's about giving them the support to be there with them, you know, to try and get them out of that mindset by getting them to express why they're feeling like it and escalating it even further, like to the nurses, to making sure that they were aware.
And you've said that you've just said that you would get other staff members involved, and in your statement you do say that if you felt you couldn't confidently manage a situation, you would get another member of staff to take over. What would happen in a situation where the ward was short-staffed? How would that situation be dealt with?
You'd obviously, if that patient was feeling that way, we'd have to keep that patient safe. And it was about making sure you knew where they were. They would sometimes be, if they were feeling that way and we didn't have the, it's horrible to say, but if we didn't have the staff available to give that time, then they may be moved up an observation level. So instead of being checked once in an hour, they were checked 4 times in an hour.
Thank you. I now want to ask you some questions about sexual safety. Do you remember there being any incidents of sexual safety on the ward, either involving patients or involving staff?
No.
And do you remember whether you had any training in relation to sexual safety?
We do have training around sexual safety and, you know, whether we're raising alarms and whether we feel uncomfortable reporting any concerns and everything, whether it be patient, staff, patient on patient, staff to patient, and vice versa. We're always told to report it, but I've never experienced anything.
And in your experience, did you understand the processes for reporting sexual safety issues?
Yeah.
Thank you. I will now ask you some questions about staffing on the ward. At paragraph 24 of your statement, you say that staffing levels were adequate. But you also note, in the context of carrying out observations, that sometimes staff could be stretched. You recall missing breaks, and there were occasions on which management could not secure bank and or agency staff to provide additional support. And you say that this would cause burnout for some staff, resulting in absence. I have known staff turnover to be quite regular on the ward, myself only being there for 2 years before moving on. How frequently would you say you missed breaks as a result of staffing pressures?
Not regularly miss. It wouldn't be like once a week or twice a week, anything like that. It would be on the rare. It was a rare occasion that we'd miss break, but there were times where we did miss breaks because, you know, staff had come in and they'd gone home sick, and at the site we had what was called a site buddy, which is an extra member of staff for where they were needed. They could have been put onto another one of the wards because there was only ever one site buddy. So it was a case of we'll continue doing the obs, and we just looked after each other when we were still there.
When you say that the turnover was quite regular, how frequently would you say is staff turnover?
When I started there, it was like about 1-2 members of staff would leave a month, and then you'd get new staff members. And then I think there was an occasion there was like 4 members of staff were leaving in the space of a couple of months, or less than a couple of months.
And did these staff leaving create unfilled vacancies?
Normally the vacancies were put out if they were known. There was, you know, I know of one staff member that was sick and was long-term sick, and their vacancy, as far as I'm aware, I don't believe was filled. So because they're still ongoing sick, even though the shift that they would have been on was filled, it wasn't a case of it was a permanent member of staff.
Thank you. You refer to staff experiencing burnout. Did you experience burnout?
Yes.
You also refer, paragraph 35 of your statement, to suffering from compassion fatigue. Was that compassion fatigue and burnout part of the reason, or the reason that you decided to leave inpatient work?
Yes.
And were there any steps, any actions that the trust could have taken to mitigate burnout or compassion fatigue?
I was being burnt out because of doing long days. It wasn't just about the ward, it was my home life as well. So one was going into the other. I had support where my home life was through obviously my ward manager. And it was like I'm just going to be, it was like work and home life were very similar, is the way I can put it. So I wasn't able to leave my work at work and my home life at home because it was two similar things.
But in terms of the compassion fatigue, is there anything that the trust could have done, any steps that could have been taken to improve that situation for you?
I don't know if there could have been.
You refer to the long shifts, and you make reference to this in your witness statement as well, to 12 and a half hour shifts. And you say sometimes there is insufficient time to decompress between shifts, and this has an impact on staff. What impact did these long shifts have on staff performance, and how did that translate into impact on patient care?
It could be like if you're doing 2 long days in a row and you've not had time to decompress from one shift and you've had a busy shift the day before, then you go in to do another busy shift the following day. It just wears you out. So it was wearing me out, but I wouldn't let it impact how I cared for the people on the ward.
Thank you. When I started the questions in this section, I noted that in your statement you started off by saying staffing levels were adequate, but then we've just talked about some of the pressures on staff and some of the difficulties with staff. And Zoe Bunton, who was your manager, has also told the inquiry that managing staffing levels has always been a challenge. And she said, for example, that staffing constraints had a direct impact on the ability to deliver observations as prescribed. And they also had an impact on other areas. For example, the extent to which care planning could be collaborative and the extent to which engagement with families could be done adequately. Is that consistent with your experience?
I would agree with that.
Thank you. I will now ask you some questions about the training that you received. I'll come on later to training about observations, but for now, focusing on paragraph 28 of your statement, where you say that NHS bank staff received the same training as permanent staff, but agency staff did not. Do you know how the trust ensured that agency staff were nevertheless conversant with the trust's policies and procedures and the specific policies and procedures for the ward before they came to work on the ward?
I'm not aware of.
Did you observe any differences in understanding, in the level of understanding of policies and procedures between permanent staff and bank staff on the one hand, those who had trust training, and agency staff on the other hand?
You're on about the difference in the training?
Did you observe any difference in understanding? Was it your experience that there was a better understanding of policies and procedures by that permanent staff and bank staff had a better understanding than agency staff who had not received training?
I wouldn't feel there was much different, but obviously they don't. I don't know what the agency staff's training are. All I know is they're not trained by the NHS.
Thank you. You explain at paragraph 27 of your statement that you received basic life support training, and you considered that the training was adequate, but you do say that it did not prepare you for the initial shock of finding someone unresponsive. The inquiry has heard evidence from another witness who said that none of the training courses involved any practical scenario training. Do you think that basic life support training, which includes a practical scenario, would have helped?
When I've done with the NHS, I've done the enhanced one, that basic life support. So obviously I've had that extra bit of training to what the normal training, baseline training is. And I think everyone should have it. Everyone should have that extra bit of training, to be honest.
The immediate life support training, is that what you mean? But in terms of dealing with the shock of a live situation, is there anything that you think could be done to mitigate that?
I honestly don't know. Obviously, because we use the Annies, which is the dummies, then it's, you know, people sit there, it's not a real person.
Thank you.
So it's, you know, you can't do CPR on a real live person, can you? So I don't think there is any preparation out there unless the instructor is really hard on the trainees and say, and make it into, in inverted bracket, a real life situation kind of thing. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
What I understand you to be saying is that it is difficult to replicate the circumstances of a real life scenario.
Yes.
Thank you. We've now been going for 30 minutes, and we can take a break if you would like to.
I'm fine.
You're fine to carry on. I'll now turn to asking you questions about therapeutic observations and engagement. You explain at paragraph 11 of your witness statement on page 2 that you only ever used 3 levels of observations on the ward. So level 1 is once an hour check. Level 2 is 4 checks within an hour and also knowing where the patient is. And level 3 observations is always within eyesight. Is that correct? Do you know what level 4 observations are?
Level 4 observations is when you're next to him.
Yes, so within an
Arm's length.
Arm's length. Yes. In practice, did you have sufficient time to engage with patients while carrying out observations?
If you was on a level 3 with someone, yes. Because you're, you know, generally if you was on that level 3, you'd engage with that person. Level 2s, you're going around, obviously level 2s, and whoever was doing level 2s did the level 1s as well. So you're going around just seeing where people are. Some people would come up and talk to you while you're doing that observations. So, and you try and engage with them, but you knew that you had to make sure everybody else was in a safe place, everyone else was there.
And so you would not necessarily engage with patients if you were carrying out level 1 or level 2
No, you try not to, because you was trying to be aware of where 17, 18 patients were. But when you was on level 3, you was able to, because it's more of a one-to-one.
Thank you. You explained that when you started off on Peterborough ward, recording of observations used to be paper and that this resulted in the timing of checks being estimated. Can you explain why paper records resulted in estimation of the timing of checks?
Because we weren't wearing watches and things like that, you know, and we just, it must have been 2 minutes later. You'd get distracted by other patients, as I was saying a bit before. Someone would come and ask you a question, or they wanted to engage with you. So it just wasn't accurate timing, because you didn't have the watches on you to be able to go, right, okay, and write it down.
And when would the time be recorded? Would it be whilst you were carrying out the observations? But what you're saying is you didn't have... We'd
have a board, write it as we were going along, once we'd seen that person.
And in your experience, was this the practice on the ward, that the times would be recorded in this way, would be estimated in this way?
Generally, yes.
Did you have any concerns about the reliability of times that were recorded in this way?
Sometimes it wasn't accurate.
And so you would accept that, for example, estimating times could affect subsequent investigations into if an incident occurred, in terms of establishing exactly when the patient was last observed?
Yes.
Thank you. You explain at paragraph 12 of your statement that you sometimes experience barriers to completing observations, and you give an example of an alarm going off or another patient needing support. You then say that some changes were made in 2021, which meant that you would not need to attend any alarms unless it was you that raised it. Prior to these changes being made in 2021, how often were you diverted from observations?
I would say daily, with the patients, you know, with, like I've expressed earlier, with the patients wanting to come up and engage with you, delaying the check on the next person.
And would you be pulled off one-to-one engagement by these distractions?
If you was on a level 3, no. You stayed with your person.
But level 1 and level 2?
Level 1 and level 2, you could be obviously distracted.
Why were changes made in 2021 which resulted in you not needing to go away, for example, to respond to an alarm?
I don't know why, I can only guess. And it possibly could have been due to the incident that happened on the ward.
And is the incident you're referring to the death of Adam Steele?
Yes.
And how were you informed of the changes to the way that observations were to be carried out after the incident?
I believe that we were just told that we were going to go to like a pad version, and it was the ward manager told everyone that whoever's on level 1s and level 2s to redirect people to another staff member.
And so electronic tablets were introduced. Yeah. And was this at the same time that Oxyvision was introduced?
Oxyvision was already there when I started.
When you started?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And obviously, sorry, I missed the Oxyvision part. With Oxyvision, when I came on shift, I always used to use it just to check in the morning, just to check where everybody was. And it was stopped us doing that. We had to go and do a visual check. Because sometimes we'd look through people's doors, but we had to, after the incident, open the person's doors and check for breathing.
Thank you, and I will return to Oxyvision and the changes after Adam Still's death. I will return to those in detail shortly. In terms of staffing pressures and observations, did you witness staff falling asleep or becoming disengaged during observations?
Not falling asleep, but you would see, you know, someone's doing their observation and they're, you know, they're in the dining room and they're checking who's in there and someone's gone up to speak to them. So that's generally because we were doing other stuff, we weren't watching who was doing the observations, if you know what I'm trying to... Or am I mishearing?
No. My question was did you witness staff not being able to carry out observations adequately because of the pressures on their time?
I can only say what was on my time. And sometimes, you know, there was times where you were trying to get the 4 in the hour and you've just spent 15 minutes with someone else because within them 4 checks in the hour wasn't at set times. So because otherwise the patients would get used, all right, 15 minutes, they'll be back. So it was a case of you could do 5 minutes apart and then leave it for 15 minutes. But you'd gauge what the ward environment and the individuals were like.
Thank you. I will now ask you questions about the training you received on observations. And if I take you to paragraph 13 of your statement, you say that the training I recall was from staff that knew the system. Your reference to the system there, are you talking about the Oxyvision system?
Yes.
Okay, so I will leave the Oxyvision system for the moment and ask you questions about training on observations in general. Did you undertake any training on observations before you started working at ePut?
I cannot recall taking any.
And what about training on observations at any point in your career?
I can't recall any. It was from learning from staff to staff, from what I can recall.
And is that the same in relation to how to engage with patients? Did you receive any training in relation to that?
To engagement?
Yeah.
I don't know if it was if it was before that, but the only things I'm thinking about is like open questions, closed questions, and
in terms of that, where did you receive that training?
that would be with ePut.
With ePut. Were you required to complete an observations competency checklist when you started at Peterborough Ward?
I can't recall.
You say that you were informed that the policy for engagement and observations could be found on the internet, as well as being in a folder on the ward. You say you don't recall any training on it other than to read it. Was reading the policy mandatory?
I don't recall if it's, you know, all policies that are, I don't know about reading its policy. We get told, I was told to read up on all the policies, and we're shown where the folder is. We get told it's on the intranet, and we do spend whatever time, you know, within the first week we're shadowing, so we do go through the folder.
So do you recall reading the policy?
I don't recall reading it.
Do you recall whether anybody checked, any manager checked, whether you had read the policy?
No.
Would more formal training on observations and engagement would that have been useful to you in carrying out and understanding the purpose of observations?
I think it would have been beneficial.
Thank you. I will now ask you some questions about Oxyvision. So I've taken you to paragraph 13 already, where you say the training was from other staff that knew the system. You say you can't recall whether there was online training. You say that you were able to advise and train new staff members when they were shadowing you. You also say at paragraph 15 that you had no specific training for Oxyvision other than being shown how it works. And you say that a better explanation with training at the time would have been more beneficial. Would it be correct, therefore, to say that the training that you received on Oxyvision was informal?
Was in fault.
Informal.
Informal. It was from another staff member.
And how was it delivered? Was there a specific time allotted for that training, or?
It's whoever you were shadowing, and you was obviously shown around the board, shown where everything was, fire points, and you was then shown the Oxyvision and just told how it works, and then shown obviously your press, and then what you press vitals, and then things would come up and be recorded.
And so the people who you were shadowing would show you how the system worked, and who would that be typically?
Another HCA.
Another healthcare assistant. And how did the managers on the ward, for example, the ward manager, satisfy themselves that you were competent in operating the system?
They didn't, that I recall.
Do you recall ever being given a copy of the Oxyvision standard operating procedure?
No.
Do you recall ever being told about or given any training informally or guidance about how the procedures would be, the procedures in the SOP would be implemented, and how they would be updated?
No.
You mentioned giving patients leaflets about Oxyvision. So apart from those leaflets, did you see any written information about Oxyvision and how it functions and how it's supposed to be used?
I can't recall, no. Just the leaflets that we used to hand to the patients just to make them aware that it was there.
And when you say that it would have been a better explanation with training would have been beneficial, at the time that you were being shown how Oxyvision worked, did you have concerns about the training that you had received in relation to it?
Not at the time.
In terms of using Oxyvision, what was your understanding of the purpose and how it was to be used?
It was there, it alerted you when someone came out of their bedroom. it let you know whether someone was in the room, whether the room was empty, and we would use it just for a quick visual check, especially if we had concerns about whether a patient's mental state. So it'd be like an extra that we'd use it against the 4 other checks.
So if somebody was on level 2 observations, you're saying that the check via Oxyvision was an extra check? And
Should have been an extra check. But I know that some people used it as one of their checks.
And to what extent did people use it as one of the checks? Was this widespread in your experience on the ward, or was it a few people that used it as one of the 4 checks?
I don't know if it was widespread or not, but I know, you know, and I'll put my hand up, myself included, had used it a couple of times as a check.
Can you talk us through how Oxyvision and the electronic pad that you use with it, how that is used to carry out observations? If you walk us through how you would use the system to carry out in the course of an observation.
The pad wasn't the OxyPad. You know, we had the Oxyvision on the screen,
Yes.
and the pad was separate. The pad would give your levels 1s and 2s, and it was like your paperwork on a pad. So I can't recall if that was connected to the Oxyvision.
And so if you were using the Oxyvision system in connection with an observation, how would you use the Oxyvision system? What would you do? Could you take us through the steps of how you would use the system?
You'd press on the room number.
And where would you press on the room number?
On the screen.
And where is the screen?
In the office.
In the office.
You'd see where if the person was in the room or not. You could see if they were moving. There is a bit on there that you could press vitals, and it would tell you their pulse rate. And I can't remember what else. I think there was 2 things it could tell you. Breath rate. I think it's pulse and breath rate. And then it'd be after, I think it was like 10 or 15 seconds, it would go off.
And so you could use the Oxyvision system remotely from the office to check on vital signs, the pulse rate and the breath rate, and you could also use it remotely to observe a patient.
Yeah.
And you've already said that sometimes, for a patient who was on level 2 observations, for example, that remote observation could count as one of the 4 observations within an hour.
Yeah.
I think it's a convenient time to take a break. When you were giving your answer in relation to the way in which you conduct level 2 observations, you explained that you might not engage individually with patients because you would be trying to be aware of 17 or 18 patients. Does that mean that one person would have been responsible for example, conducting level 2 observations in relation to 17 or 18 patients?
Yes. And you did that for an hour. Sometimes, obviously, you'd end up going on doing it for 2 hours.
And so there were times where the entire unit was on level 2 observations, and it was the responsibility of one person to conduct those observations.
More so on the level 2s, yes.
Thank you. In terms of the accuracy of time recording on paper, you explained that one of the reasons why time couldn't be recorded accurately was because healthcare assistants weren't wearing watches. But could that have been remedied by wearing a watch? Would that have ensured that you were then able to record time accurately?
For me, it would have been. I'd be able to look right time. Or even more clocks.
More clocks in the
More
unit.
clocks within the unit.
Within the unit. Thank you. And then could you tell the inquiry whether you are aware of oxyobs? What oxyobs? Whether you're aware of what oxyobs is?
Oxyobs.
Yes.
I just believe it's the Oxy Health obs. Or
And what is your understanding of what that is?
I'll have to say no.
My question was whether you're aware of a device, an electronic device that was connected to the Oxyvision
Oh, the
system.
hand one?
Yes,
Yes.
that was used to take observations.
We never used to take that round with us. That was, someone would have it.
And so the only way that you would conduct observations using the Oxyvision system was, as you've described previously, from the...
Either on the little small thing or in the office on the...
And so on the little small thing, could you have used the little small thing in the way that you could have used the screen in the office?
Yes, you could do.
And were you, as a healthcare assistant, able to use the device in that way?
I could use it in that way if I wanted, but for level 2 obs, we used to just walk round. I'm getting confused, sorry.
In the course of your evidence earlier, you were explaining that the handheld devices weren't used to carry out observations. I'm just trying to understand what the nature of, what the type of the handheld devices that you had, what it was and what it could do, and how you used it.
When we had just the Oxyvision before it went from the paper to the tablets,
Yes.
it's the Oxy one and the new one were two separate things. So the hand tablet for the Oxyvision is the same as on the screen.
Same as on the screen in the office.
Yes.
And then what was the change?
The change was we had tablets come in where you had to record level 2 obs and level 1 obs of like where they were, and there was bits in there that you could put in bedroom, sort of like sitting in lounge, awake, asleep and things like that. You had to put in what the person was doing when you did that check.
And you would move around with
Yes.
with that tablet.
Yeah, you was not able to visually see them on that tablet.
Thank you. I will now ask you some questions about Adam Steele's case. In the statement that you provided to the inquest into his death, that is exhibited to your statement to the inquiry, you explained that you used that you conducted a preliminary level 2 observation. What did you mean by preliminary level 2 observation?
When I used to go in, as I've said earlier, in the morning, that was a thing that I did, that I would check the Oxy Health to see where everybody was, to see whether they were asleep, awake, just for my own peace of mind.
And this was the check in the office that you...
That was a check I did on the monitor in the office.
And did that constitute one of the 4 levels?
On that day, I put it down as one of the 4 because I was then given the level 2s.
Thank you. I will now ask you questions about learnings from the death of Adam Smith. You say that following the death, paragraph 34 of your statement, you were informed that Oxyvision was not to be used as a level 2 check, and all checks had to be visual, even if it meant opening a patient's door and waking them up. How was that learning communicated to you?
Team meetings.
And are you aware whether that learning was shared just at your ward level or whether it was trust-wide?
I don't know if it was trust-wise, but I knew it was on our ward.
And did this information impact the way in which staff conducted observations in practice?
As in... In your experience, did staff comply with that Yes.
direction? Zoe Bunting has given evidence to the inquiry to say that she personally issued reminders of face-to-face checks being required for level 1 and level 2 observations. Were those reminders given after the death of Adam Steele?
Yes.
Thank you. I will now ask you about the extent to which patients consented to the use of Oxyvision. At paragraph 16 of your statement, you say that some patients did not like the idea that of Oxyvision being used and would cover up the camera with stickers of paper. And was it your understanding that those patients weren't consenting to the use of Oxyvision?
Some of them, yes, I would agree. They didn't, it was like they did not want to be, they didn't feel comfortable. And I would explain to them again that it was there not to spy on them or, you know, to watch them. It was there to check that they were safe.
And what process was followed if a patient insisted that they did not want to be observed using the Oxyvision system, whether they said it in words or by their actions, they demonstrated that they did not want to be observed?
We would just report it, like escalate it to, as an HCR, we escalate it to the nurse in charge. And then, I don't know where, to be honest, I don't know where it went from there.
And so you don't know what action was then
No.
taken as a result? You've described the fact that patients could be observed from the stations, and you could go into the live feed of them in the bedroom. To what extent were patients aware of the fact that they could be observed at any time when the Oxyvision system was on in their bedrooms?
They were informed upon entrance to the, once they came onto the ward.
And how were they informed?
We'd verbally tell them, and there was leaflets that we gave.
And do you recall what information was contained in the leaflets that they were provided with?
Not the exact information, but it was around of how, that it was there and how it worked.
Thank you. I will now ask you about the response to investigations in general and the support that you were provided. You have said at paragraph 36 of your statement that you considered the investigation following Adam Steele's death to have been timely and professional. Were you given an opportunity to contribute to that investigation and to the recommendations arising from it?
not with recommendations arising from it, but obviously contributing the fact of witness statements and obviously speaking with the police.
Were you informed of how the recommendations that flowed from, apart from the one that we've discussed, were you informed of how any other learnings from that incident, how the compliance were to be monitored and how any steps that will be taken in relation to the learnings from that incident?
No.
You describe in your statement going into shock after finding Mr. Steele deceased. Following that incident, was there a formal debrief undertaken?
I cannot recall a formal debrief because we continued with the rest of the day. Obviously, Mr. Steele was found first thing in the morning and we continued with the shift. And it was just supporting each other as a team. So if we needed time out, we could. Zoe said if we needed to speak to her, we could. And being able to take a step back throughout the day when we needed to.
And how would you describe the adequacy of the support that you were provided with in that process?
As a team, we supported each other good then.
You describe the communication and leadership on the Peterborough ward as positive, and you say that the learning incidents were shared. What was it that contributed to the positive leadership in the ward at the time?
Can you rephrase that for me?
In what way do you consider that the leadership was positive? How did that manifest? And in what way did you feel the benefits of positive leadership on the ward?
On that day?
Not on that day, just generally.
The leadership I class as the nurses in charge. And whilst I worked there, the nurses in charge, in my opinion, were good nurses. They supported their staff as well as they could.
And you do say in your statement that ward managers were visible, that daily huddles took place, at which concerns could be raised and they shared new practices. Do you know whether there were any steps to record actions arising from those huddles and to monitor what steps were taken in relation to actions raised, in relation to concerns raised at those huddles?
Obviously, the huddles were recorded, and then it would be the ward manager that would escalate any concerns or anything else. As to what the process was after that, I wouldn't know.
Thank you. And finally, coming on to your recommendations, you suggest that the inquiry should consider crisis services beyond inpatient wards. And you refer to an occasion where a crisis team described some suicidal behaviour as attention-seeking. Was this in any way related? Did this circumstance arise out of your employment with EPUT?
It was whilst I was working for EPUT, and it was personal circumstances that made me see the parent side and what a family member can struggle with to actually get the support from the mental health services, not just wards, but even the crisis line to begin with.
Thank you. Those are all the questions that I have for you. Thank you.
Mr. Lampard.
Chair, that concludes the evidence for today. We'll resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. when we will hear evidence from 2 comparative trusts on their use of Oxvision, namely Tees, Esk and Weir Valleys NHS Foundation Trust and Leicestershire Partnership NHS Trust.
Thank you very much indeed. Tomorrow morning at 10.
Yeah.